Stephen Emmerson is a professor at Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, where he has been on the full-time staff since way back in the last century. In addition to undergraduate classes, he has been increasingly involved in the teaching and supervision of postgraduate research and has convened master's and doctoral research programs there over many years. He also convenes the Master of Music Research program delivered at the Australian National Academy of Music in Melbourne. His work in recent years has been deeply involved with developments in artistic research through a wide range of collaborative performance projects. He has master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Oxford, and since 2004 has been a founding member of the Queensland Conservatorium Research Centre. He sustains a broad range of musical interests and activities, including a busy career as a pianist and chamber musician, having performed widely in concerts and festivals around Australia, New Zealand, Europe, UK, and Asia. And we're delighted to have Stephen with us today to present this guest lecture entitled Creativity in the Performance of Western Classical Music. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Denise. And look, it's a pleasure to be with you all, even though it's virtual and a bit weird. It's weird, but isn't it also remarkable? So today I just want to share some thoughts with you on a very big topic. I'll pass over quite a number of things fairly quickly, but hopefully leave you with some sources that you can explore if these ideas are new to you. I want to talk a little bit about this issue of how performance has been viewed in the Western classical music tradition. And then I suppose at the end, most immodestly, I just want to point to a couple of my recent performances just to sort of underline some of the issues that I've discussed here. My background as a musician was fairly split for some time. My postgraduate studies were in, I suppose, what you call musicology, music analysis. I was looking at scores, analysing music of Bartók. I was also, the other part of my personality was, my musical identity was playing the piano. I played lots of Bartók. But actually, when I was writing about Bartók, I never mentioned myself. I never drew on my experiences performing. And so my sort of dual parts were quite split. So it's been a really quite wonderful thing to observe how in one person's sort of career, how profound the changes have been within the scholarly study of music and its attitudes towards music performance. These days, I feel far more complete being able to connect my identities as performer and scholar and thinker with the music making that I do. There's a quote here. For generations, musicologists have behaved as though scores are the only real thing about music. And I suppose when musicology was getting started, that was understandable insofar as scores were sort of rather tangible artifacts that could be examined and analysed and discussed in ways that seemed to be much more promising than the very ephemeral nature of music performance itself. But it did lead to some really quite disparaging attitudes towards music performance and a very unfortunate separation between musicologists and performers. Here's a quote here from Nicholas Cook. He writes, musicology was set up around the idea of music as writing rather than music as performance. And to think of music as writing is to see its meaning inscribed within the score, and accordingly to see performance as the reproduction of that meaning. And that turns performance into a kind of supplement to the music itself, an optional extra. I might recall, say, Brahms, who was invited to go and see the opera Don Giovanni, but said no, he'd prefer to stay home and just read through the score, as though that was a viable and, in his case, preferable alternative. But as Nicholas Cook writes here, I think we need to think differently about what sort of object music is, and indeed how far it is appropriate to think of it as an object at all. I would hope many of you will be familiar with this book. It's getting quite old now, Christopher Small, but certainly that was a game changer for many of us and a very provocative sort of challenge to those of us who play Western classical music. But the basic idea was this very powerful argument that, well, apart from some problems within the culture of Western classical music, that the way we think about music as an object needed to be changed. The music isn't actually an object, but is actually an activity that we do. In other words, a verb rather than a noun. So moving from this idea of Werktreue, which was Lydia Gurr and Taruskin very much building these arguments in the 80s and 90s. I would guess many of you are familiar with these texts. If not, I think they still hugely recommend them. Certainly, they were life-changing from my point of view. Even that title of Taruskin's book there, Text and Act, sets out his basic premise. The text, the score, and the act of music making are something quite distinct. And Taruskin just seemed to give a beautiful way of discussing performance in a way that seemed profoundly important. He's provocative and challenging and, you know, full of some ideas that upset lots of people, but these ideas were life-changing, certainly for me. I remember very distinctly the first time I encountered them. More recent books that are along the lines I'm discussing today, Nicholas Cook's pulling together of lots of scholarship on the thoughts around music as performance is, again, hugely recommended if you don't know that. Cook talks about this idea of the paradigm of reproduction, which has sort of dominated lots of the culture of Western classical music. He writes, in this paradigm, performance is seen as reproducing the work or the structures embodied in the work or the condition of early performances or the intentions of the composer. And different as each of these formulations are, and the last can serve as a justification for almost anything, they all have one thing in common. No space is left for the creativity of performers. The other point I just want to underline here is that the worst thing about skewing of musicology towards viewing music primarily as a written text, as a score, is that it cuts academic studies off from precisely the dimension of music that touches most people. So this challenge of a lot of these basic underlying assumptions of Western classical music, that what we are doing are reproducing works, is something that is of vital importance. It all hinges around the limits of notation and the illusion that all a performer needs to do is to obey the instructions given in the score is a terrible delusion. You might get away with it, I suppose, in a Mahler symphony. You wouldn't get away with it with Brahms. You wouldn't get away with it in Bach, let alone Handel. I suppose it's one of for me, one of the lovely things about MIDI playback of a score just underlines for us just how essential are all those subtle nuances that a performer brings to music, which aren't in the score, which are far from trivial. As Cook mentions there, performance is the art of telling detail, of nuance, detail that falls between the notes of music texts and the words of literary ones. I want to just start with a little compilation that I made of the opening of the Goldberg Variation. It's a point which might seem very obvious, but I hope it just reminds us of what performers do. these two. Okay. Now, of course, there's obvious differences, tempo, pitch, all of that, but also huge number of very, very subtle differences of shape, of nuance, of ornamentation, of, dare I say, meaning. What the piece is actually saying can be transformed really quite profoundly by how those notes are interpreted. Just want to play one more. I'll just play a little bit of this one. Perhaps you already know this example, but it just underlines the case. It's not just the performance, but the way the piece is recorded also profoundly changes the music. You get the idea. I think that this idea of looking at recordings again has been a major and very welcome move in the scholarship of how we study music. And I think particularly the recordings from early in the century have some very important lessons for us that people are coming to realize much more profoundly these days. I want to play you a little extract from a soprano, one of the, this was recorded early in the 20th century, 1905, by Adelina Patti, a Mozart aria. Now, this soprano was among the most famous musicians of the 19th century. Verdi thought she was among the finest of artists. I think she made, someone told her she made more money than the American president, and she said, well, let's hear him sing. Let's just listen to her singing Mozart in 1905. I don't know if any of you have heard this before. If you haven't, it might be a bit shocking. Now, obviously, no one actually sings Mozart anything like that these days. Those swooping portamenti, the freedom with the rhythm she takes, even the sound of the voice is so fundamentally different. I think these examples are really important for us to underline just that how we perform music changes pretty profoundly. So from the same score can come some profoundly different music. This quote here from Daniel H. Wilkinson, he says, "Music has changed more than one could ever have imagined. Scores we think must be performed one way were performed very differently a century ago. The same notes can make and have made substantially different music." A lot of scholarship has taken up on these points. Lots of institutions, several leading institutions. I might just draw attention here, the CMP and their publications. They're looking at music as performance as creative practice. Similarly, from the Orpheus Institute in Ghent, representing quite different approaches in some respects. Certainly the performance studies is seen to be quite distinct from artistic research in the minds of many people. In particular, artistic research, I suppose, is becoming very widely accepted as an approach these days that look at performance not just from analysing it from the outside, but specifically from the perspective of the musician who is making it. So the artist's perspective on their music making is deemed to be essential to the whole process. Now, as I say, the scholarly world has embraced this idea of creativity. I'm jumping onto a bandwagon that's been building for some time. What is striking, of course, though, is that the general cultures of Western classical music are not taking on board this paradigm, but actually are in many cases still very stuck to this paradigm of reproduction. Another quote from Nicholas Cook here. He says, "Nobody is in greater denial of the creativity of performance than performers." And this is one of the aspects of our culture that I think is very important for us to address, the way we talk about classical music, what we're doing as performers, what we're aiming to achieve. Let me just say a few words about creativity itself. This is a definition from Margaret Bowden. She says, creativity is the ability to come up with ideas or artifacts that are new, surprising, and valuable. And I suppose when we think about classical music, for many people, it's a heritage thing. It's something from the past. And so to present it in a way that is new and surprising is not necessarily what most classical musicians might be striving to do. She makes an important distinction between what she calls psychological creativity and historical creativity. I suppose historical creativity is when someone has a new idea that no one has ever had before. On the other hand, psychological creativity might be a much more significant one. It involves coming up with surprising and valuable ideas that are new to the person who comes up with it. And I suppose the burgeoning literature on creativity has emphasized the sense that creativity is not just the special talent of outstanding people, but that we all have creative skills, that we should use it every day and build upon it. Let me just check how my timing's going. Whoa, I need to keep moving. So towards a paradigm of creativity, what would a more explicitly creative approach to Western classical music look like, or more importantly, sound like? For those of you who do not know this site, I would very strongly recommend it. You can find it just by Googling challenging performance. You can see the web link there, challengingperformance.com. This is Daniel Leach Wilkinson, who is among the most outstanding spokesmen for a rethinking of what Western classical music might look like. So if we just quickly look at what he says there, he says, over the past 6 decades, the way that classical scores are performed has grown increasingly homogenized. We make the case for allowing performers to be much, uniform, and performers to be much more creative. As I say, would you highly recommend you all to visit that site if you don't already know it. He will argue the case far more persuasively than me, and in much more depth. As you can see there, there's a whole book that is being constructed there, as well as recordings, interviews with other creative musicians. So highly recommended there. I should also mention that there's all sorts of reasons why you might not embrace an explicitly creative approach to the performance of Western music, because there is quite a lot of resistance in all sorts of forms within our cultures. Daniel draws attention to a huge range of abusive terms that are thrown at performers who get in between the composer and the listener: indulgent, self-indulgent, self-serving, egotistical, an unwelcome intrusion between the music and the listener, etc. Certainly, if you're wanting a good mark in an examination, or wanting to win a piano competition, or wanting to get a good review in Gramophone magazine, there are creative approaches are not necessarily going to be welcome. I'll leave that quote there, but essentially that's him arguing that actually the current normative approach to performance is policed in all sorts of ways that are unjustifiable. Sorry, we'll keep moving on if you excuse me. He proposes what he calls, elsewhere, a type of radical performance. Again, I would recommend that as someone who's arguing for a really quite profound change to the cultures of classical music. I'd prefer to see it somewhat differently. So on one level, I might be seen to be setting up a duality here between experimental performances, radical performance, divergent performances, challenging performances on one side, and the opposite of those on the other side, which are traditional approaches to the interpretation of a score. And actually, I don't want to do that at all. I don't see these as two incompatible things. I'd like to see them just as ends of a spectrum of creative possibilities. And it does seem to me that a healthy culture of Western classical music is not about having these two extremes, but having all sorts of things that cross this spectrum. So that I'm not for a minute against traditional approaches to interpretation. And I'm certainly not promoting only experimental approaches. As I look at the work that I do, I would see that I move up and down that spectrum quite regularly. And some performances are much more traditional than others, some are much more experimental than others. Where that is depends upon all sorts of factors, depends upon the context of where I'm playing it. Very often it depends upon who the other musicians are I'm working with. And very often I'll have a piece which might start on one end of the spectrum, where I play it fairly traditionally, and move on to explore more experimental approaches to it. So I want to give you an example of that later on. But I hope this is a fairly useful way to be thinking about this, that it's not about two oppositions, but a smooth spectrum between them. So I'm not proposing for a minute that one side is good and the other side is bad. As I say, I think for me, a healthy culture of Western classical music is one where across that spectrum, many approaches are represented. So some of the parameters for creativity within Western classical music. Some of these are musical. And so down one end of the spectrum, one can have enormously creative musicians who are doing relatively traditional approaches to interpretation, but are nonetheless new and surprising and I think valuable. I think, well, any number of examples. Martha Argerich, every time she plays something, it sounds fresh, like you've never heard it before, Theodore Corentis. There's lots of people there. So the idea of playing with subtleties of colors, textures, balance, micro timing, subtleties of rubato, flexibility, all of these are ways in which we can find fresh new meanings. If you think back to those examples of the Goldberg aria that I played earlier, hopefully these things will be clear. And also this approach to improvisation, which of course was so much a part of what musicians did in the 18th and 19th century, but has rather disappeared from the training of musicians in the 20th century. I would think of improvisation not just as something where you make up lots of notes, but improvisation as a state of mind that embraces spontaneity. So you improvise with your colors, you improvise with your micro timings and your shapes. You respond to the moment, you respond to your other musicians, to the acoustic that you're playing with, to the context in which your music is being made. And this can be enormously creative in a very traditional context. And absolutely endorse those sorts of approaches. On the other hand, there are many other ways in which creativity can be explored. Clearly, programming is a hugely, I think, important way in which we present our music. And this thought that we just present a series of pieces that follow each other, I think its time is limited. That how we hear a piece depends upon what we put beside it. So if we hear Beethoven after we hear Mozart, we hear it differently. If we play Beethoven after we hear Ligeti, we hear it differently. What we put beside it, what we put in conjunction with it, changes the way we can hear it. I remember an Australian pianist presenting the Hammerklavier Sonata of Beethoven, and his program notes were full of all about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is around the same time as the Hammerklavier. And then he played the Hammerklavier in a way that one hadn't heard before, and just the idea of conjoining those ideas allowed a very fresh and I believe a very creative way of hearing it. Also, of course, what we present visually with the music has all sorts of possibilities. Where I work at the Conservatorium, in Queensland, our recital hall has a huge screen to project images, and that is open to all sorts of really wonderful creative possibilities. Then there's also this idea of challenge the autonomy of the musical work. This thought that the musical work just stands on its own and is self-contained. Yes, it is, and it can be, but the possibility of music to connect with other ideas is hugely, is full of huge potential. Now, these might be connecting with other musical ideas. They might be connecting with lots of ideas outside of music. They might be historical ideas, like that Frankenstein Hammerklavier example. Of course, the historically informed performance practice movement is a hugely creative movement. Once they stopped pretending that they were recreating the music of the past, but being inspired alternatively by historical ideas and artifacts, the outcomes have been enormously creative. But also, music from the past can intersect with all sorts of ideas from our own time. And the possibilities there have been explored by many, and I would encourage, any performer to be open to those ideas. Also, multidisciplinary connections. It's the other big transformation in the academic world I've been in for the last few decades, is this emphasis towards multidisciplinary awareness, that music isn't just an island, that it intersects with all sorts of other disciplines in very fruitful ways that illuminates important things about music and what it is. I'll give an example of that shortly. And then this is the one that's always been most exciting for me, is that the different musicians that I collaborate have been enormously stimulating to me. in terms of refreshing my approach to pieces and finding new things in them. So let me just check my timing here. Okay, so as I say, most immodestly, I just want to point to some examples from my practice. Mainly, I was wanting to talk about a recital I did last year, which I had some, dare I say, creative dimensions. And I found that actually to set that up, I needed to sort of talk about developments many years previously. So if you will excuse me, I'll just quickly talk about my relationship to the Goldberg Variations. It's an ongoing project called Reimagining the Goldbergs. It started here. This is in New South Wales in Australia. It's the home of a music festival called the Four Winds Festival of essentially classical music. As you can see, in a beautiful, beautiful setting. And in 2012, I was invited to do a performance there on two pianos. You can see the lovely crowd sitting on little portable chairs with their hats and a lake in the distance. The concert was on Easter Sunday morning. And what do you play on Easter Sunday morning? The first thing we played was a new work commissioned by the festival, which was all full of bird songs or transcriptions of bird songs from the local area. And we had tons of frogs and tons of birds singing as we performed that live. But it was for this that I first had the idea of arranging the Goldberg Variations for performance on two pianos. Why would one do that? Well, I mean, I suppose it will hopefully present a new and perhaps surprising way of hearing the work. It just seems to me that that's the underlying reason for why we should keep playing Western classical music, is to find new ways of hearing it, new ways of engaging with it. And I suppose what I wanted to do was to turn the Goldberg Variations, rather than being a sort of dazzling virtuoso showpiece, into something that was more manageable, sharing the difficulties between two people. So yes, certainly the arrangement is less virtuosic than the solo version. But what I wanted particularly was to inject into the work a sense of dialogue between two performers, a sense of chamber music. If you know about the Goldberg Variations, it's for a two-manual harpsichord, and the two manuals, the parts of the manuals cross regularly. So it's exceedingly difficult to play, virtually impossible to get around some of those issues on a single keyboard on a piano. So this thought of actually making the piece more straightforward was to, as I say, bring in the sense of dialogue, the sense of chamber music, but also in the way we interpret it, to give it a sense of more playful spontaneity. I also had in mind its pedagogical potential. But of course, changing a piece from two hands to four hands meant that I was adding all sorts of bits to it. And of course, the question was, how much to add, how much not to add? Am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to add to Bach? This great masterpiece, is this sacrilegious? I won't answer that question. I suppose from a research point of view, this concert led to a whole number of other performances of the arrangements in concerts, in festivals, at conferences. I suppose what's striking about these was the fact that the arrangement didn't stand still for a minute, that we were continually readjusting things, adding parts, taking parts away, swapping parts, adding ornamentation. So just as the arrangement was changing, the way we interpreted it changed profoundly. I then did talks about it in various conference presentations, wrote a paper about the sort of rationale of why I would do that. I suppose for me, the part of the reason to engage in any of this stuff is about how we keep a work fresh. I think it's one of the dangers of Western classical music is that we just get used to playing and hearing a work one way. So this process of how to stay creatively engaged is an important issue, I think. And for me, as I say, a lot of this is benefits from encounters. These might be ones I deliberately seek or serendipitous. They might be musical encounters with people, with recordings or with concerts. They might be engagement with ideas, but most often they're engagement with people who I make music with. In 2015, I got to play my arrangement with another pianist. This was a good friend of mine in Singapore, Bernard Lansky. And Bernard is, he's a remarkable man, remarkable musician, but he also is very interested in mathematics. And he sponsored this, what's called a Mathemusical Conversations Symposium in Singapore. And so for the Mathemusical Symposium, we played this arrangement of the Goldberg's for two variations. And Bernard had all sorts of mathematical metaphors that actually transformed the way we heard and played the piece. It wasn't better, it wasn't worse than the other wonderful pianist I got to play with, but it was profoundly different and profoundly energizing. Again, we ended up, writing about that, how those mathematical ideas really quite profoundly stimulated an interpretation of music. A different interpretation of music was a really exciting one for us to explore. Then we were invited to present this mathemusical approach to the Goldberg Variations in Oslo, in Norway, in a wonderful symposium there called Unfolding the Process. The trouble was that we were only given time for a 35-minute performance of the Goldberg Variations, which is normally about 50 minutes, even without repeats. So again, is this terrible sacrilege. I not only didn't play all of the Goldberg Variations, chose 18 of them. I chose them very carefully with a great deal of thought to try and give a sort of coherent structure to them. And then, oh, sorry, this is even more sacrilegious. We didn't play them all in the key of G major. We developed a tonal structure across this particular version of the Goldberg Variations. And then I wrote about that to try and justify the sacrilege of that. Then this concert that I did last year, again with Bernard, this was in Brisbane this year. This was again, programmed for two pianos and keyboard, I might add. Oh, hang on. It was called 3 with 2. And the basic idea grew from the mathematical ideas we'd been playing with in the Goldberg Variations. You would all know of the number symbolism in Bach's music. If you look closely at the Goldberg Variations, these numbers of 3 and 2 just come back in all the parameters of the music. So we developed this program that wanted to develop and try and show to people how to appreciate these relationships that are embedded in so much of Western classical music. So the aims of this particular recital last year, one, I suppose, was to complement the listening experience with suggestive visual stimuli, and to try and present a new type of recital program where encounters with familiar music, much of it from the Western music, the classical music canon, and to hear it in a new light. Certainly, we extended beyond just music for two pianos. There was arrangements of string quartets and string sextets and symphonies and trios in there as well. The idea was to connect with those arithmetical things I talked about before. I don't want to say more about that at this point, except that, of course, that it grew from the previous encounter with the Goldberg Variations. So the whole idea was to promote an active engagement and curiosity from the audience by only revealing certain things gradually and leaving much to be explained. So the program wasn't a series of autonomous pieces that followed each other. They were explicitly linked and connected. Many of them were extracts from pieces, and we built that into an overall coherent design with the idea of trying to stimulate a different and very active form of listening from our audience. So within this program, there was some of the Goldberg Variations. We only had room for 5 of them. So we, again, just selected some from them to form a suite of our own. The Variation 16 is a sort of overture. Variation 1 needed to be adapted to make it into an allemande. Then, as you can see, the other variations there. So again, there's a lot of liberty taken with Bach there in all sorts of ways. To what extent that's desirable, I don't know, but certainly from a point of view of living with a piece and allowing it to grow and creatively develop, it's enormously satisfying from my point of view. So, how am I going for time? Yes, sorry, I shall finish very soon, but just to leave you with a few conclusions. I would think of creativity as an attitude, an approach. And I think that it can challenge some of the underlying assumptions in the culture of Western classical music, most notably that of reproduction and autonomy of the work. It comes with the recognition that a work is not a fixed or stable thing at all, never has been. It always has involved a dynamic relationship with generations of performers. And this must be considered essential to the music, but also Western classical music if it is to remain, or just regain, its relevance and meaning in our lives. If Western classical music can't find new ways to sound through its performers, then perhaps its disappearance to the periphery of Western culture, is inevitable. I would just also underline there that our creative response to work can be enhanced through encounters with new ideas, with people and performance contexts that reflect our contemporary world. How radical the transformation revolution needs to be, I suppose, depends on one's point of view. As I say, people like Daniel Leach Wilkinson would see it in far more radical terms than I perhaps would propose, but I think it's so important that those arguments are there. I suppose what I would want to change, though, are the dominant narratives that are hanging around Western classical music, so that the way we talk about it is not primarily about the composer's idea or concept or vision, but moves towards that of the performer. That our discussion isn't just about musical works, but about music making. That we move from reproduction to from experimentation, from rather playing to playing with, and I suppose most importantly, rather than dealing with heritage artifact from the past, to realize that the making of Western classical music has an important place in our world today.